The wrong man always gets questioned first. The words landed in the hallway a second before Dr. Elias Carter stepped out of operating room 3, with the ache of 4 straight hours still burning through his shoulders. The bright surgical lights were behind him now, but they still lived in his eyes, white and sharp, leaving ghost halos over everything he saw. His navy scrubs were marked with the long, exhausting work of saving people who had come in all at once after a highway pileup on I-95, and his gloves were already gone, tossed aside the second the final monitor steadied into something that sounded like mercy. 3 patients. 3 lives still hanging on by threads, but alive. Alive because he had not stopped moving when everyone else in trauma had felt the room closing in. Alive because he had trusted his hands, his training, and the quiet voice inside him that never got louder, only steadier. He should have felt relief. Instead, the first thing that met him in the corridor was a hard voice cutting through the antiseptic air. "Sir, put that down and step away from the surgical wing." Elias looked up slowly. A security officer stood near the double doors, shoulders squared, one hand lifted, eyes fixed not on Elias's face but on the blood on his scrubs. The hallway seemed to lose heat all at once. Nurses near the desk stopped typing. A transporter froze with one hand on a wheelchair. Somewhere farther down, a machine kept beeping impatient, even intervals, as if nothing at all had changed. Elias's chest rose once, then settled. In his right hand was not stolen equipment, not anything dangerous, only a sealed chart and a disposable cap he had forgotten to toss away. His hospital badge hung at his waist, twisted backward, the name hidden against the fabric. The officer did not ask who he was. He did not ask where Elias had come from. He saw a tall black man in a restricted hallway with blood on his clothes, and in that instant his mind made the rest of the story on its own. Elias had lived long enough to know how quickly that happened in America, even inside places built to save lives. "One of my patients is crashing," he said, and his voice came out calm enough to shame the panic around him. Through the glass panel of the ICU doors, he could already see motion shifting in the room at the end of the corridor, a nurse leaning over a bed, another reaching for the phone, the kind of movement that meant numbers were dropping. "He needs me back in there now." The officer stepped closer instead of aside. I said step away. The words were louder this time, meant for the room, meant to establish control. Elias could feel every eye turning toward him, measuring him, sorting him into categories that had nothing to do with the years he had spent earning the right to stand in this building. Son of a night shift nursing aide. Scholarship kid. Top of his residency class. The surgeon people called when the bleeding would not stop and the clock had almost run out. None of that showed first. Not tonight. Tonight, what showed first was his skin, the streaks on his scrubs, and the terrible old habit of being feared before being recognized. He glanced once more through the glass. On the bed inside, a child's hand twitched against a white blanket. Elias looked back at the officer, then past him, toward the administrators gathering at the corner, and something colder than exhaustion moved through him. "If you keep me here," he said softly, "you won't be stopping a threat. You'll be stopping the doctor who just saved 3 lives." And for one suspended second, with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the whole corridor holding its breath, nobody moved. The silence broke with the soft rush of rubber soles on polished tile. A nurse came around the corner, so fast her breath nearly failed her, one hand gripping a tablet, the other still pulling off a glove she had forgotten she was wearing. Nina Brooks had worked enough overnight shifts with Elias Carter to recognize the look in his eyes before he spoke, that fixed and distant focus that only came when his mind was still inside the body he had just fought to save. She looked from him to the security officer, then to the cluster of people starting to gather near the nurse's station, and whatever color had been in her face seemed to drain straight into the bright hospital floor. "Dr. Carter needs to get back to ICU now," she said, not loudly, but with the kind of certainty that should have ended the moment right there. It did not. The officer barely glanced at her. His jaw tightened instead, as if her words were only another complication in a situation he had already decided he understood. Elias felt the seconds moving in his chest the way he sometimes felt a heartbeat changing under his fingertips in surgery. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just wrong. There was a specific rhythm to hospital time, and the people who understood it knew that a single minute could separate recovery from disaster. He turned his head toward the glass again. In the room at the end of the corridor, one monitor had changed its pattern. The line still moved, but too fast now, too thin, too nervous. The child inside that room, 8-year-old Sophie Lang, had survived impact trauma, internal bleeding, and a desperate emergency procedure because Elias had refused to let panic lead the room. He had opened, repaired, called for blood, and closed with the kind of precision that only looked calm from the outside. But post-operative recovery was a narrow bridge, and some patients did not stay on it without help. "She is dropping pressure," he said. His voice stayed level, but something heavier sat beneath it now. "If I do not get to her bedside in the next minute, she may need to be intubated again." A few people in the hallway shifted when they heard that. Medical words did what his badge had not yet done. They forced reality into the room. At the nurse's station, a unit clerk looked up from her screen. A respiratory therapist slowed to a stop. A resident in wrinkled scrubs glanced between Elias and the officer, then quickly looked down, as if eye contact itself might become a choice he would later regret. Nina stepped closer and turned the tablet outward. The surgical log glowed across the screen in pale blue and white, full legal names, case numbers, timestamps, operating room assignments. There it was, clean and undeniable. Lead trauma surgeon, Dr. Elias James Carter. Beside it were the 3 emergency procedures he had completed in just over 4 hours. Each one marked critical. Each one marked successful, at least for now. Nina swallowed. "He led all 3 surgeries," she said. "You are delaying the attending physician." The words hung in the air, but the officer did not move right away. Embarrassment had begun to gather in the corners of the moment, and embarrassment often made people hold their ground longer than wisdom would. Elias had seen that too. He had seen it in exam rooms, boardrooms, elevators, and donor galas where people mistook his silence for uncertainty and his patience for permission. He knew the look that came just before someone realized they had been wrong, and he knew how often that realization arrived only after harm had already been done. Down the hallway, the monitor alarm sharpened. Not frantic yet, but urgent enough that every trained ear heard the change. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He only looked at Nina, then at the screen in her hand, then back at the man blocking his path. "You can doubt me later," he said. "Right now, that child needs oxygen, blood pressure support, and a doctor at her bedside." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Around them, the corridor had grown full without anyone noticing. 2 family members stood near the elevator doors whispering to each other. A volunteer clutched a cart of warm blankets and stared openly. At the far corner, framed by white walls and glass offices, a woman in a fitted cream jacket had stopped walking altogether. Vanessa Whitmore, chief administrator of St. Matthew's Medical Center, had arrived just in time to witness the part of the story no press release could ever cleanly explain. Her eyes moved from the officer to Elias, then to the tablet in Nina's shaking hand, and for the first time that night, uncertainty crossed a face that was usually arranged to suggest control. Elias saw her see it. The blood on his scrubs. The hidden badge. The surgeon she had passed in meetings without remembering. The dangerous cost of assuming the wrong thing about the right man. And still, even with the truth now glowing in plain sight, the distance between Elias and the ICU doors felt longer than a football field. Vanessa Whitmore did not like surprises, and St. Matthew's had already given her too many in the last 6 months. A medication error that nearly made the local news. A donor complaint about wait times in the private wing. A labor dispute she had buried under careful language and polished statements about institutional values. She had spent years turning herself into the kind of administrator who could walk through crisis without showing strain, heels steady, voice measured, expression composed enough to calm a room before she even spoke. That control was part of how she had survived, part of how she had risen, and part of why people moved aside when she entered a hallway. But now, standing under the sharp fluorescent lights with a crowd forming and a child in ICU losing stability by the second, she felt control slipping in the most dangerous way possible, not in public noise, but in private uncertainty. Greg Holloway turned toward her, as if waiting for confirmation that the situation was still his to command. He had been at St. Matthew's less than 3 weeks, hired after Vanessa promised the board tighter security, stronger protocols, fewer questions from lawyers. Greg looked the part people trusted without effort. Broad shoulders, clean haircut, former law enforcement posture, a voice that carried authority even when he was wrong. Men like Greg moved easily through institutions because confidence often arrived before evidence. Vanessa knew that. She had built systems around people like him. She had rewarded decisiveness, speed, visible order. And now all of it stood in front of her like a mirror she did not want to face. On the tablet in Nina's hand, Elias Carter's credentials glowed with quiet, humiliating clarity. Board-certified trauma surgeon, attending physician, surgical lead on all 3 emergency cases. Nothing about the screen was dramatic, and that made it worse. Truth rarely needed spectacle. It only needed to be seen by people who had refused to look. Elias stood a few feet away, shoulders squared, breathing controlled, not because he was calm in the ordinary sense, but because years of discipline had taught him what panic did to a room. Vanessa had seen him before, though the realization came with a sour weight she could not hide from herself. In meetings about staffing shortages, in donor dinners where he arrived late from surgery and left early without trying to charm anyone, in internal reports praising outcomes in the trauma unit. She had noticed his numbers, his efficiency, his rare ability to steady teams under pressure. But she had never really noticed him. Not as a man carrying a life harder than his resume suggested. Not as someone who probably entered rooms already calculating how quickly he might be misunderstood. The monitor alarm sounded again from inside. ICU, and this time there was no mistaking the edge in it. Nina looked ready to run whether she had permission or not. A respiratory therapist had already taken 2 steps toward the room. The whole corridor had begun to divide into 2 kinds of people, those still protecting procedure, and those finally hearing the patient at the center of it. Vanessa felt every eye near her now, waiting to see what kind of leader she really was when pride and consequence stood in the same place. Elias did not try to win the moment. That was the part that unsettled her most. He did not argue his importance. He did not demand respect. He only watched the ICU doors with the quiet urgency of someone whose mind was still beside a hospital bed. In that instant, Vanessa understood something she had spent a career avoiding. Power did not always reveal character when things were easy. Sometimes it revealed character when the wrong person had already been doubted, and the right response would require admitting it out loud. Her throat tightened almost imperceptibly. Greg was still waiting. The staff were still watching. The child was still crashing. And the next words Vanessa chose would tell everyone in that hallway whether St. Matthew's was a hospital that protected life or just the appearance of order. Vanessa drew in one careful breath, and when she spoke, her voice was lower than anyone expected. Let him through. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of something larger than permission. They were an admission, a correction, and a test all at once. For half a second, Greg Holloway did not move, as if the hallway itself had to rearrange around the fact that the man he had treated like a threat was the one person most qualified to stop the crisis unfolding behind the ICU doors. Then he stepped aside. Not quickly, not gracefully, but enough. Elias Carter did not waste a single second on anger. He moved past him with the sealed chart still in one hand, the disposable cap crushed in the other, his pace controlled but urgent, every step aimed at the child whose condition had been deteriorating while adults argued over appearances. Nina was already beside him, matching his stride. Pressure is falling, she said. Respiratory rate is uneven. The resident started fluids, but she is not responding the way we hoped. Elias pushed through the ICU doors, and the colder air of the unit wrapped around him like another layer of focus. The sounds inside were sharper here. Monitor tones. Soft commands. Wheels turning over tile. A parent crying somewhere behind a curtain in the next bay, trying to keep the sound small enough not to frighten anyone else. Sophie Lang lay against white sheets that made her look even smaller than 8 years old, one arm tucked near her side, the other attached to lines and tape, in the fragile machinery of modern mercy. Her mother stood in the corner with both hands over her mouth, eyes glassy, frozen in that private place where hope and terror become indistinguishable. Elias moved to the bedside and the whole room seemed to settle around him, not because the danger had passed, but because leadership had arrived in a form the body could recognize. He checked the monitor, then Sophie herself, then the line placements, then the chart in Nina's hand, his gaze moving in fast, practiced order. "She is compensating," he said quietly. "But not for long." He asked for lab values, reviewed them in seconds, then adjusted the plan with the precision of someone who had seen this edge before and knew exactly how thin it was. "Increase support. Call respiratory back in. Prepare for imaging if her numbers do not turn in the next 2 minutes." Nobody in that room questioned him. They moved. That was the difference competence made when people allowed themselves to see it. Outside the glass, the hallway had not emptied. Vanessa remained where she was, one hand resting against her opposite wrist, so lightly it almost looked casual. But there was nothing casual in her face now. She watched Elias through the clear panel as he leaned over the bedside, his voice steady, his expression focused, his presence changing the atmosphere of the room from alarm to disciplined action. She watched Nina respond without hesitation. She watched the respiratory therapist return at a near run. She watched the resident who had looked down in the hallway now look directly at Elias with the open attention of a student standing too close to a lesson he would never forget. Greg stood farther back, near the nurse's station, his posture still rigid but no longer confident. On the floor near the wall, something caught the light. Elias's hospital badge had come loose in the confusion and fallen face down on the polished tile. A volunteer with a blanket cart noticed it first. She bent, picked it up carefully, then turned it over. The silver letters reflected the overhead light with almost unbearable clarity. Dr. Elias James Carter. Trauma surgery. For a moment, she only stared, as if reading the name was not the same as understanding everything that had just happened around it. Then she looked toward Vanessa, uncertain whether to hand it over or bring it inside. Vanessa crossed the floor herself and took the badge in silence. It was still warm. There was a faint rust-colored mark near the edge where it had pressed against Elias's scrubs, a reminder of what he had been doing before anyone stopped to question whether he belonged there. She held that badge longer than necessary, thumb resting against the printed name, and an unfamiliar feeling moved through her, not exactly guilt, not exactly shame, but the beginning of a truth with nowhere left to hide. She had spent years making decisions based on optics, protocols, and the people who looked reliable at a glance. But through the ICU glass, she could now see the cost of that instinct more clearly than any board report had ever shown her. The wrong delay in the wrong hallway, and a child might have paid for someone else's prejudice. Inside the room, Sophie's monitor changed again. The tone softened. Not safe yet, but steadier. One of the nurses released a breath she had been holding so long it almost sounded like a prayer. Elias did not celebrate. He kept working, eyes on the numbers, one hand adjusting a line, the other reaching for the chart Nina offered. His voice stayed calm, but the room had changed around it. Relief was beginning to return in cautious inches. Outside, Vanessa looked down at the badge once more, then lifted her eyes to Greg. He met her gaze for only a second before looking away. And in that quiet, humiliating space between them, both of them understood the same thing. The crisis inside the ICU was not the only emergency that had just been exposed. For the next 12 minutes, nobody in the ICU spoke above what was necessary. The change in Sophie Lang came slowly, the way dawn sometimes enters a room before anyone can point to the exact second night is gone. Her blood pressure edged upward in small numbers that would have looked meaningless to anyone outside medicine. But Elias Carter saw them the way a pilot sees a runway through fog. He stayed at her bedside, reading every shift in color, rhythm, and response with the same disciplined attention that had carried him through the operating room. Nina Brooks moved beside him with quiet efficiency, handing him updates, adjusting lines, relaying labs the moment they appeared. A respiratory therapist hovered near the head of the bed, ready but no longer rushing. Even Sophie's mother, who had spent the last several minutes standing so still she seemed afraid movement itself might undo the fragile improvement, began to lower her hands from her face. Not all the way, just enough to breathe. "That is better," Elias said, and because he did not use words carelessly, everyone in the room felt the weight of them. Better did not mean safe. Better did not mean the danger was over. But better meant the child still had a bridge back. Better meant the worst possibility had loosened its grip for now. Outside the glass, the corridor had grown quieter in a different way. The earlier tension had drained into something heavier, more human, and much harder to escape. Vanessa Whitmore stood near the nurse's station with Elias's badge still in her hand, no longer pretending it was a small object. It felt like evidence now. Not for a courtroom, not yet, but for the kind of truth that leaves institutions exposed to themselves. Greg Holloway had moved several steps away from the ICU doors, yet he had not left. Men who are sure of themselves leave quickly when they think a moment has passed. Men who realize they have misread a moment stay because something inside them is trying to understand how it happened. Greg kept looking toward the glass, then toward the floor, then at the staff who were no longer hiding their expressions as carefully as before. He had spent most of his adult life believing quick judgment was a form of competence. It had probably helped him before. It had probably even earned him praise. But now that instinct stood in public light, stripped of its confidence, and what remained did not look like strength. It looked reckless. It looked small. Vanessa turned the badge over once, then again, reading the name as if repetition might deepen the lesson. Dr. Elias James Carter. The letters were plain, official, without ego. She thought about the donor dinner 2 months earlier when Elias had arrived late after an emergency trauma case, still carrying the fatigue of work no one at the table could imagine. One of the board members had mistaken him for support staff and asked him to fetch sparkling water. Vanessa remembered hearing the comment, noticing the brief pause in the room, and choosing not to correct it because the evening was already running behind schedule. Elias had not corrected it either. He had simply moved past the moment with that same impossible composure, and somehow that had made it easier for everyone else to pretend nothing had happened. Now the memory returned with a fresh edge. It was never only one moment. It was a chain, a pattern, 1,000 small permissions granted to the wrong assumptions until one night those assumptions stood in the path of a doctor trying to save a child. A younger resident stepped up beside the nurse's station and said quietly, almost to himself. He told him she was crashing. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The sentence settled over the hallway like a verdict no policy manual could soften. Through the glass, Sophie shifted faintly on the bed. Her mother let out a sound so fragile it was almost a laugh, almost a sob, then covered her mouth again as if joy might also be too loud for a room like this. Elias checked the monitor once more, then finally stepped back half a pace. The hardest edge of the emergency had passed. He removed one glove, then the other, and for the first time since leaving the operating room, his shoulders lowered by an inch. It was not relief exactly. Relief belonged to people who had not been forced to defend their right to do the work they were already doing. What settled over him instead was something quieter and more difficult. He had seen this pattern before, in different buildings, with different faces, under different rules. The details changed. The wound did not. Nina looked at him, her eyes full of the words she probably knew better than to say in front of everyone. He gave her the smallest nod, a thank you for the tablet, for the timing, for being the kind of person who chose truth faster than comfort. Then he turned and walked out of the ICU. The corridor made space for him immediately. Staff shifted aside without being asked. The volunteer with the blanket cart lowered her gaze. The resident straightened. Even the fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, exposing too much. Vanessa stepped forward first. She held out his badge with both hands, as if returning it required more care than picking it up had. Elias looked at it, then at her. There were no dramatic words in his face, no visible anger, no performance of injury. That made the moment harder, not easier. Because outrage can sometimes be dismissed. Dignity cannot. Vanessa swallowed before she spoke. Dr. Carter, she said, each syllable shaped with painful precision. There needs to be a conversation about what happened here tonight. Elias took the badge from her, wiped the edge once against the clean part of his scrub top, and clipped it back into place where it should have been seen all along. When he answered, his voice was calm enough to stop the hallway cold. There should have been one a long time ago. The hallway did not return to normal after that. Hospitals were built to keep moving, to absorb shock and keep the wheels turning, but some moments settled into the walls and refused to leave. This was one of them. Elias Carter stood for a second with his badge clipped back where it belonged, the silver edge catching the fluorescent light, and listened to the sounds around him as if they were coming from very far away. A monitor beeped in a slow, steady rhythm behind the ICU glass. A printer hummed at the nurse's station. Somewhere down the corridor, an elevator opened with a soft chime and then closed again. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary hospital sounds. But after what had just happened, They all seemed thinner than before, as if the building itself had been forced to hear something it had spent years ignoring. Vanessa Whitmore lowered her hands to her sides. For the first time in a long time, she did not seem to know what posture leadership required. Her face was composed in the professional way she had perfected over years of board meetings and donor calls. But there was something strained underneath it now. Something less polished and more honest. "Dr. Carter," she said again, quieter this time, "I am sorry." The words were careful, but they were not enough, and everyone in that hallway knew it. Elias looked at her, then past her, toward the glass doors of the ICU where Sophie Lang now slept beneath warm blankets and white light, because he had been allowed back inside in time. The image steadied him. It reminded him what mattered. He had learned long ago that dignity was not something other people handed to him. It was something he had to carry for himself, especially in places where people kept trying to make him prove he belonged. He thought of his mother coming home from double shifts with her shoes in her hand, because her feet hurt too much to keep them on. He thought of the way she used to stand in the kitchen under a weak yellow light and tell him that some people would look right at him and still refuse to see him. Not because he was lacking, because they were. At the time he had been too young to understand how heavy that truth was. Now it stood in front of him, wearing hospital credentials and polished shoes. Greg Holloway had still not spoken. He stood near the wall with the stiffness of a man whose certainty had just collapsed in public. His face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Not full understanding. Not yet. But the beginning of it. He looked at Elias's badge, then at Elias himself, and it was clear that he was seeing both for the first time. "I followed procedure," Greg said at last, though even he seemed to hear how weak it sounded the moment it left his mouth. Elias turned his head slightly. He did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He did not need to. "No," he said. "You followed an assumption." The sentence entered the corridor and seemed to settle on every surface. Nobody challenged it. Nina Brooks stood a few feet away with her tablet against her chest, her shoulders finally loosening now that the emergency had passed, but her eyes stayed fixed on Elias with something close to heartbreak. She had seen enough medicine to know that clinical mistakes could be corrected. With training, repetition, discipline. But what had happened in that hallway had not started as a clinical mistake. It had started in the older, uglier place where people decide who looks trustworthy before they know a name. Vanessa exhaled slowly, as if even breathing now required effort. "You are right," she said, and the admission sounded harder for her than apology. "This cannot be handled quietly." Elias studied her for a moment. He could tell she meant it, at least tonight. But he also knew how institutions protected themselves. He knew how quickly urgent truths became carefully worded emails, then private reviews, then language about misunderstandings and regrettable incidents and opportunities for improvement. He had watched that pattern unfold in other hospitals, other committees, other polished rooms where the harm was obvious, but accountability somehow became abstract. He would not let that happen here. Not after a child had nearly paid for it. Not after an entire hallway had watched the same old lie try to outrank the truth. He glanced once more through the ICU glass. Sophie's mother had taken a seat beside the bed now, one hand resting lightly over her daughter's blanket, shoulders shaking with the delayed release of fear. The sight softened something in him, but it did not weaken his resolve. Kindness never had. People confused that all the time. They mistook calm for surrender, patience for permission, grace for the absence of memory. Elias had spent his life proving that gentleness and strength could live in the same body. Tonight would be no different. He turned back to Vanessa. "Then do not handle it quietly," he said. "Handle it truthfully." The words made the air feel still again. A resident near the nurse's station lowered his eyes. The volunteer with the blankets blinked fast and looked away. Even Greg seemed smaller somehow, not because anyone had humiliated him, but because the truth had taken away the shelter of his own self-image. Vanessa nodded once. Not the easy nod of a person trying to end a difficult conversation, but the reluctant nod of someone understanding that this one was only beginning. "There will be a formal review before morning," she said. "Security footage, witness statements, every minute of it." Elias gave no sign of relief. He was too tired for that, and too familiar with promises. Still, something important had shifted. Not solved. Shifted. The hospital had been made to look directly at itself, and for one fragile moment, it was not looking away. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the far windows of the surgical wing, a light spring rain moving over the city in the deep hours after midnight. The sound barely reached the corridor, but Elias heard it. He had always liked rain in hospitals. It made the world outside feel quieter, less certain, more honest somehow. He stood there in the white light, exhausted to the bone, and felt the weight of the night settle into something he could carry. Not because it was fair, because it was true. And in the stillness that followed, with the rain touching the glass and the monitors keeping their patient rhythm, everyone in that hallway understood that the next part of the story would not be about what was almost lost. It would be about who had finally been seen. The formal review began before the rain had finished tracing silver lines down the far windows of St. Matthew's. By 2:15 in the morning, the conference room on the administrative floor was no longer a place for polished updates and donor briefings. It had become something far less comfortable, a room where time was measured in replayed seconds, and every second carried weight. Vanessa Whitmore sat at the head of the long walnut table with a legal pad in front of her that remained mostly blank. Greg Holloway sat 3 chairs down, shoulders rigid, hands clasped too tightly, the confidence that had once made him look decisive now stripped away by fluorescent light and silence. Nina Brooks was there in clean scrubs, her tablet resting flat beside her, and 2 residents had been asked to stay as witnesses. At the far end of the table, Elias Carter sat with his hands folded, posture straight, fatigue written into the lines around his eyes, but not into his voice. He had changed into a fresh scrub top after checking Sophie one last time. The new fabric was clean, but the night still clung to him. Vanessa nodded toward the wall monitor. "Start from the surgical wing camera," she said. No one argued. The footage came up in pale grayscale first, then sharpened. There was the corridor. There was the double door opening. There was Elias stepping out with the sealed chart in one hand and the disposable cap in the other, moving with the measured speed of a man still halfway inside an emergency. The room stayed silent as the recording played. The angle was merciless in a way only cameras could be. It showed what people claimed to miss in real life. Elias emerging from the restricted wing. Greg turning before he had enough information. The immediate change in posture. The raised device. The blocked path. Then the crucial part, the part that settled over everyone at the table like cold water. Audio from the adjacent hall camera picked up Elias's voice, calm, controlled, unmistakable. "One of my patients is crashing." A few seconds later, again, more urgently but still composed. "If I do not get to her bedside in the next minute, she may need respiratory support." The timestamp kept moving. Nobody in the room looked away. On the screen, Nina came into frame with the tablet. The badge at Elias's waist stayed turned backward. Greg never once asked for identification. Never once asked for a name. Never once looked for confirmation before making the moment larger, louder, and more dangerous than it had any right to be. The camera did not capture motive. It did something worse. It captured sequence. And sequence left very little room for denial. Vanessa asked for the footage from the body camera next. Greg looked up at that, a quick flash of resistance crossing his face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He knew what was on it. Everyone did. The video switched angles. Now they could see what Greg had seen, or rather what he had failed to see. Elias in blood-marked scrubs. The hidden badge. The chart. The cap. The urgency in his stance. Then his own voice, not loud, not threatening, just steady, trying to redirect attention to the child in ICU. "You can doubt me later. Right now, that child needs oxygen, blood pressure support, and a doctor at her bedside." When the sentence ended, nobody at the table moved for a long moment. The rain touched the windows. The air conditioner hummed. Somewhere outside the conference room, a phone rang and was quickly silenced. Greg stared at the screen as if it belonged to someone else, as if the version of himself speaking from it were a stranger he did not want to know. Vanessa leaned back slowly, her face losing the last traces of administrative distance. "This was not protocol failure," she said at last. "This was judgment failure." Elias did not correct her. He let the sentence sit there because it was only half complete, and she seemed to know that. Nina was the one who finished it. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "No, it was bias." The word entered the room without decoration. Nobody called it too strong. Nobody asked for gentler language. The evidence had already chosen its own vocabulary. Greg finally spoke, but the authority was gone from him now. I made a call based on the situation in front of me. Elias turned his head and looked at him fully for the first time since the meeting began. No, he said, and his calm was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. You made a call based on what you thought a surgeon should look like. Greg's mouth opened, then closed. Across the table, one of the residents lowered his eyes. Vanessa looked down at her blank legal pad, then back at the screen, where Elias's face remained frozen in the paused footage, tired and focused, and still trying to save a life, while being treated like he did not belong. The room had reached the point where the truth was no longer unfolding. It was standing there in plain view, asking every person present what they planned to do with it. Vanessa folded her hands. Security privileges are suspended effective immediately, she said, and this time her voice did not waver. Greg did not protest. Perhaps he understood it would only make the room smaller. Perhaps for the first time in years he had no language left that could protect the version of himself he had trusted. Vanessa turned to Elias next. There was no boardroom polish left in her expression now, only the difficult effort of someone trying to speak honestly after far too much silence. Dr. Carter, she said, this hospital owes you more than an apology. Elias held her gaze, and the rain on the windows seemed louder now, though it was only the room growing still enough to hear it. It owes the truth to every person who works here, he said, especially the ones who learned a long time ago that being excellent does not always stop people from assuming the worst. No one answered because no one could. The footage was still paused on the wall behind them, the image fixed in that unbearable moment before recognition arrived. And in the cold light of the conference room, with proof glowing 10 feet wide for everyone to see, the hospital's real crisis was no longer hidden in a hallway. It had a timestamp, a witness list, and a face. By the time the first gray light of morning touched the eastern edge of the city, the conference room no longer felt like a place where anyone could hide behind titles. The review had ended, but its silence remained, settling into the corners like dust no one could sweep away. Vanessa Whitmore stood by the window for a long moment before turning back toward the table, and when she did, the practiced polish she had carried for years seemed thinner than it had just a few hours before. Greg Holloway sat motionless, his security credentials already deactivated, his radio silent at his side like an object that had lost its meaning. Nina Brooks remained near the door, too tired to pretend she was unaffected, but too steady to leave before the truth had finished unfolding. Elias Carter had not moved much. He sat with the same composed stillness that had carried him through surgery, crisis, humiliation, and testimony in a single night. The difference now was that everyone in the room understood what that composure cost. Vanessa took a breath that sounded almost unsteady. There will be a formal statement to the board at 7, she said. There will be written findings. There will be a staff briefing before noon. And there will be no language in any report that hides what this was. She paused, and the room seemed to hold itself in place around her. It was racial bias. It interfered with patient care. It endangered trust in this hospital. Greg closed his eyes for a brief second, not in protest, but in the exhausted way people do when a truth becomes impossible to outrun. When he looked up again, the hardness had gone out of him. He looked older now, smaller somehow, as if the uniform confidence he had worn had finally slipped and revealed the frightened ignorance underneath. He turned toward Elias, and for a moment it seemed as though he might reach for some careful excuse, some softer wording, some version of events that would make him less responsible. But the night had taken that option from him. I was wrong, he said. The words came slowly, like they had weight. I saw what I expected to see, not what was there. Elias said nothing at first. He had heard many apologies in his life, some sincere, some strategic, some offered only because witnesses were present. The difference was rarely in the words. It was in what the apology was willing to lose. Greg's voice was unsteady now, stripped of certainty, and that mattered more than volume ever could. I put my assumption ahead of your authority, Greg continued. And worse than that, I put it ahead of the patient. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Nina looked down at the tablet in her hands. No one interrupted him because there was nothing left to protect. Elias finally spoke, his tone calm, almost gentle, but impossible to dismiss. Then do not apologize to me as if this started tonight. Greg looked up. Elias held his gaze without anger, and that made the words land harder. What happened in that hallway was not one mistake, he said. It was a pattern arriving on time. The room went still again. Rain still touched the windows in soft, fading taps, but dawn was beginning to thin it out. Vanessa drew her chair back and sat down slowly, as if her legs had remembered exhaustion only after truth had been spoken aloud. Then it ends here, she said. Elias looked at her for a long moment. In another room, with another administrator, the sentence might have sounded like performance. But something in Vanessa had shifted during the night. Not enough to erase anything. Not enough to undo what had happened. But enough to make denial impossible. He thought of Sophie Lang sleeping in the ICU with her mother beside her. He thought of the residents in the hallway, the volunteer with the blankets, the unit clerk who had heard everything, the staff who had seen a surgeon stopped before they saw him recognized. He thought of every person in the building who had learned to carry excellence like armor because respect could not be trusted to arrive on its own. He could have chosen bitterness in that moment. Nobody would have blamed him. Instead, he chose precision. No, he said quietly. It does not end here. It changes. Here, where this hospital learns nothing. Vanessa nodded once, and tears gathered in Nina's eyes before she blinked them away. Greg lowered his head, not in humiliation forced on him by others, but in the first shape of remorse that had any chance of becoming useful. Elias rose from his chair then, not dramatically, just with the deep fatigue of a man who had been carrying too much for too long. The conference room lights reflected softly off his badge, and for the first time that night, no one in the room failed to see it. Vanessa stood too. What do you want from us? She asked. Elias looked toward the brightening window, then back at her. Tell the truth publicly, he said. Train people like lives depend on it, because they do. Stop rewarding confidence that does not pause long enough to see clearly. And do not call this an unfortunate misunderstanding. His voice remained even, but every word entered the room with the weight of lived experience. Call it what it was, so the next doctor does not have to waste precious seconds proving he belongs in the room where he is already saving somebody's life. No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to add that would not diminish the moment. Vanessa gave a small, solemn nod. Greg's shoulders folded inward, not from shame alone, but from the beginning of understanding. Nina placed one hand over her mouth and looked away, overcome not by sorrow exactly, but by the strange tenderness of watching someone wounded choose principle over revenge. Elias turned toward the door then, ready to go back where he had always been needed most, not in conference rooms, not in statements, but at bedsides, in operating rooms, in the fragile spaces where people did not care what a doctor looked like once healing had begun. Just before he reached the threshold, Vanessa spoke again, her voice quiet enough that it almost belonged to the morning instead of the meeting. Dr. Carter. He stopped and looked back. Thank you, she said. Elias regarded her with tired eyes and the calm of a man who had no interest in being called noble for surviving what should never have happened. Do not thank me for staying, he replied. Make this a place that deserved it. Then he opened the door and stepped into the first light of day, leaving behind a room full of people who would never again be able to claim they did not know what had happened or what it had cost. Morning arrived without ceremony. By 6:30, the rain had thinned to a soft mist on the windows, and St. Matthew's had begun to fill again with the ordinary movement of a hospital waking into another day. Fresh staff came through the lobby with paper coffee cups and tired eyes. Elevators opened and closed. Phones rang. Computer screens lit up one by one. But under the routine, something had changed. It moved quietly, almost invisibly, through the halls and stations and break rooms, carried in lowered voices and unfinished sentences. People knew. Not everyone knew every detail yet, but enough had traveled before sunrise to leave a mark. They knew a child in ICU was alive. They knew a surgeon had been delayed outside a unit where he belonged. They knew the truth had not stayed buried in a hallway. Elias Carter walked back through the surgical wing in clean navy scrubs with his badge facing forward, the silver letters steady against his chest. He had not slept. The night sat beneath his eyes and in the set of his shoulders, but his steps were even, measured, familiar. This was still his hospital, no matter what the night had tried to suggest. As he passed the nurse's station, conversation softened, then parted into respectful silence. Not pity, not performance. Something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Nina Brooks looked up from a chart and gave him a small nod that held more feeling than words could have carried. Elias returned it and kept walking toward the ICU. Inside, the light was gentler than it had been a few hours earlier. Sophie Lang was sleeping, her color better now, the monitor beside her no longer sharp with warning but calm and patient, measuring recovery one breath at a time. Her mother sat in the chair by the bed with her shoes off and both hands wrapped around a paper cup gone cold. When she saw Elias in the doorway, she stood so quickly the chair legs scraped softly against the floor. Her eyes filled before she spoke. "They told me what happened," she said, voice rough with the remains of fear and the start of something deeper. Gratitude, yes, but also pain on his behalf, the kind that appears when decency meets the evidence that decency alone has not protected someone. Elias stepped closer to the bed and checked the monitor first. It was his habit to let the medicine speak before anything else. Only after that did he turn toward her. She shook her head once, as if she still could not fit the whole night into language. "You saved my daughter," she said, "and they still looked at you like you did not belong here." Elias held her gaze gently. "She is here," he said. "That is what matters most." The woman swallowed hard. "Maybe most," she said. "But not only." For a second, neither of them spoke. The room was filled instead by the soft machinery of care, the filtered light of dawn, the small sleeping shape of the child between them. Then Sophie's mother reached out and touched his hand once, briefly, with the reverence people usually reserve for prayers that have been answered. "I will not forget," she whispered. Elias gave her the smallest nod and stepped back, because some promises did not need to be enlarged by more words. When he left the room, he found Vanessa Whitmore waiting in the corridor with 2 members of the hospital board and a folded statement in her hand. She looked as if she had aged in a single night, not from weakness, but from the effort of finally seeing clearly. "The staff briefing is in 10 minutes, she said. "I wanted you to hear it before anyone else." Elias glanced at the paper, then at her face. "It is your statement," he said. "It should sound like your truth." Vanessa accepted that without defense. In the briefing that followed, the language was plain. There was no shelter in it. She named racial bias. She named the impact on patient care. She named institutional failure. She announced mandatory review, training, and disciplinary action. She did not say unfortunate misunderstanding. She did not say regrettable confusion. She did not ask people to focus only on moving forward. And when she finished, the silence in the room was unlike any she had ever commanded. It was not fear. It was conscience. Greg Holloway was not present. His resignation had already been submitted. But his absence did not erase the lesson of his presence. Around the room stood doctors, nurses, technicians, aides, clerks, transporters, people from every floor and unit, and many of them looked at Elias with a kind of painful respect, the kind that comes when admiration is mixed with the knowledge that someone had to endure too much just to make the truth visible. Elias did not speak during the briefing. He did not need the room to look at him while it learned to look at itself. Later, when it was over, he walked alone down the long corridor outside the ICU. The mist beyond the windows had lifted. Thin sunlight touched the glass in pale gold, turning every reflection softer. His footsteps made almost no sound on the polished floor. At the far end of the hall, a young resident he barely knew stepped aside and held the door without being asked. Not dramatic, not redemptive on its own, just a small act of seeing. Elias passed through with a quiet thank you and kept walking. On his chest, the badge caught the morning light. Ahead of him, the doors opened before he had to say a word. And in the stillness that followed, with the hospital breathing around him and the day beginning at last, there was no victory cry, no speech, no need for one. There was only a man returning to his work, the soft glow of sunlight on silver letters, and the deep, unmistakable silence of justice finally learning how to enter a room.